Hi, it's Dave. Today I'm joined by James Douma. He is a machine learning enthusiast and a frequent guest on my channel. And today we're going to be talking about Tesla FSD, GPT-4, AGI, and AI safety, some big topics. So, James, how are you doing?
Great. I'm doing great. It's great to
Good.
see you again.
Yeah, it's good being in Austin. We're back in this
Yeah.
physical studio, face to face. Yeah, so first off, I wanted to get your thoughts on Investor Day. I haven't talked to you in a while. Um,
Yeah,
so
it's been quite a while.
yeah, any kind of big picture thoughts? Did you have any takeaways from Tesla's Investor Day? Um, about a
There's
month
a
ago?
lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot to it. Like it's hard to summarize what's going on. Just like at the 10,000 foot level, I thought Investor Day was great. I know there were varied expectations on it. Some people's expectations weren't fulfilled, but for me, it was more or less exactly what I wanted to see. What they're thinking about, meet some more of the team, see more of a structure to the big picture for what they were doing, and get a lot of examples of like concrete things that they were doing. The um, the the overall manufacturing concept for the Gen 3 vehicle, I was really blown away by that. Like the modular approach to building vehicles
Hmm.
is like, wow, that's a huge departure from the practice that in the automobile business for so
Yeah.
long. And
Uh,
while I don't know that much about how the
yeah.
assembly goes, it like just looking at it from an engineering perspective, you can see how there's a lot of potential there for improvement with that.
Like for those who aren't kind of aware of this module approach, so they're
Mm.
dividing up the car into five sections or so, or
Kind of four,
four.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Okay.
4, 5, 6, depending whether you count the bottom and whatnot.
Yeah, and then you basically fully assemble each section, and at the end you stick them all together.
Yeah.
So, how much of that do you think is because of humanoid robots? Like they want, you know, the humanoid robots to have more access, right, around that section.
Um, I could see like I could see that being beneficial for being able to use, certainly, right?
Hmm.
But right now they use humans,
Yeah.
and as we talked about before, the thing about humanoid robots is they're drop-in replacements for humans. I mean, the form factor, the point is you put them in. So to a first approximation, if they design a manufacturing process that's good for humans, then humanoid robots are kind of a drop-in for that. It's different from how more conventional manufacturing robotics works because there are so many options for how you can build a robot. They're frequently stationary. Like you have a lot more. You in a sense you've got fewer restrictions if you're willing to reconfigure the robot for the job. But if you're going to build around humanoid robots, like a good place to start is build around humans, and then maybe if your robots for the foreseeable future, the robots are going to have a lot of weaknesses relative to humans: range of motion, speed of movement, grip strength, lots of things like that. Certainly this kind of tactile feedback thing, like I'll be shocked if they have Optimus installing wiring harnesses, because that's just really really hard to do right now. um, but as far as accessibility, the size of things that you can move, one big difference is robots won't get repetitive motion injuries, right? And that's a big constraint on how you can design assembly lines for human beings right now. So you could discard that, but in terms of access and that kind of stuff, I think it's design it for humans and then the robots drop in.
Hmm. Yeah. Like what kind of other benefits do you see from that modular kind of assembly and manufacturing
Well, I think
approach?
they explained the benefits pretty well in the slide, although it went pretty fast. But
Mm.
so currently, there's a huge access problem. I mean, there's kind of this, you know, they put the body in white all together to paint it, and then they take it apart, and so that they can have access. Because now, once you've got the basic body put together, now you have this framework, and you have to install everything in the framework. But the body is a shell with openings. So now all of the big components and all the small components, all the operations you do, you have to reach through the holes in the shell to do stuff.
Mhm.
And that really constrains the operations that you can do. And of course, how quickly you can do stuff. I mean, what you would like to do is take, like the whole dashboard and everything. You want to
Mm.
assemble as much of it as possible into the biggest possible thing and then slide it in the car once.
Mm.
Well, once you cross a certain threshold, it won't go in. And then the need to be able to do that constrains how big your doors can be, how big your windows can be, where they are relative to the dash, the alignment of the dash mounting points relative to the openings in the car, like all those become constraints. So this approach where we're going to take off the sides of the car, we're going to take the front and the back of the car, and we're going to build the front, we're going to build the back. Now instead of a shell, it's the opposite. Instead of a convex surface that you're building everything into, where you have to reach through holes, it's like
Mhm.
arthroscopic surgery, being as opposed to like working on a motor on a table or something like that.
Mhm.
Now everything's on the open. You're working on the outside of like a concave, convex surface, and you have super easy access to everything. Really big tools that are even bigger than the thing that you're working on, can get access to every single point on the object.
Mhm.
So you so now you've really opened up the space of different ways that you could look at building the front and building the back. And then another thing that they focused on was the floor space question, right? If you have a big hollow shell that's going down an assembly line and you're sticking things inside it, well, your assembly line, it has to be have the space for this big shell. And you may only be working on one little part of it, but you
Mhm.
have to dedicate a really large volume at each station to basically holding this big empty shell. So when you flip that around, and the workstation is much bigger than the object itself, because the object's getting, whether it's the front of the car, the back of the car, the side, whatever, it's getting pulled into the workstation. Now your space utilization, on your factory floor is much better. And it's like
Mhm.
I was actually surprised that they only got 40% space reduction,
Mhm.
right? Like I could easily imagine it being much larger than that. And that's probably a testament to how mature the current process is. I mean, they've been
Mhm.
building cars the way
Yeah.
they have for a long time. You would sort of imagine they get the Gen 3 process out, they have their initial thing, and then after they build the first Gen 3 factory, they're going to think of all these clever things that didn't occur to them, that now that they're discovering from process flow and whatnot that they could do, and maybe the factory keeps getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah. And what's your kind of gut feeling on how far they are with this next gen vehicle? I mean,
Yeah, well, I wasn't seeing
yeah.
I so didn't expect this kind of
Mhm.
radical rethink of the way
Yeah.
that cars get built. Like that's one of the things that makes it really exciting, because the
Yeah.
possibilities are so large for making improvements. They have to have thought a lot about it before. You can imagine the first time somebody suggests this idea, right?
Yeah.
Because it's such a radical departure. Like everybody who's worked on cars forever has been doing it the old way. There's going to be a huge amount of skepticism. The first thing you're going to see is all the problems with it.
Mhm.
I would think you'd have to be thinking about this really carefully for like years
Mm.
before it would get to the point where you would say, "Yeah, that's a good idea. We should do
Yeah.
that." So like on some level, like I don't think this is an idea they had recently. This must be something they've been thinking about for 5 years, and it's just sort of gotten to a level of maturity that they're like, yeah, we've we've done an initial factory design.
Yeah.
We've thought through all the really significant things. We don't see any bottlenecks that are going to do it. So like I would guess at that point. But like if you were to tell me, oh no, they've got the design done, they've built the tooling for most of the production line already,
Mhm.
and they're ready to go. And as soon as they get the factory in Mexico up, they're ready to send equipment. Because a lot of the tooling and everything is going to be a lot smaller, because it doesn't have to work at car scale now. We can work at
Yeah.
module scale.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, um, yeah, I wonder, like, how detailed do you think the this do they have simulations of this new factory? Do you think before they committed to it, meaning just all the advanced processes, like, I mean, on a basic level, you'll have a spreadsheet of like all the processes and how long each thing will take and all converging. But on a more advanced level, you could have some type of visual simulation of the factory, new factory actually,
I'm sure they have a
moving and
detailed
doing.
CAD model of a first
Mhm.
cut at a minimum of what they're doing. I mean, when you build factory tooling, you build CAD models of everything, and then you
Mhm.
do these articulation studies where you basically you build your tools, you build your workstations and whatnot, and then you move everything to make sure that everything actually fits the way
Mhm.
that it's a pretty important, especially the higher density you want to get to, the more sort of movement and spatial constraints you have, and the more important it is to build a really detailed model. And once upon a time, building the models were hard. And these days, building the models, like there's so many tools for rapidly being able to build models. Like I'd be shocked if they hadn't already built a model. And then once you've got your workstation models put together, you do a factory floor layout, then you do a materials flow study. I mean, you
Mhm.
can layer all this stuff on relatively quickly to look for bottlenecks, and then once you've got the bottlenecks out and you have your first cut, now you can start refining and iterating. It's a floor planning a factory.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it seems like they purposely obviously didn't talk about the design, the look of the car because it's still a while out and they don't
mm,
want to probably cannibalize their, Model 3 and Y. But they did go from the other side, which is the assembly manufacturing,
yeah.
the how they're gonna achieve the cost,
I given the choice,
goals. Yeah,
and I know a
yeah,
lot of people feel differently, but given the choice
yeah,
between, "Hey, here's the car,"
yeah.
or, "Hey, here's how we're gonna build a car," like, for me, there's no contest.
Exactly.
I'm much more excited about hearing how they're gonna build the car than the details of, like, "These are the features we're gonna put in. This is a price point that we're going for. These are the materials we're gonna use. This is the paint," like,
Yeah,
I don't the long run, like, one more car model is just one more car model. I mean, it's important to
yeah,
access a new market segment, be able to get to a price point that significantly increases the amount of volume that they can do. Like all those things are quite important. I'm a technologist, so I have my
yeah,
own biases. But as an investor, I look at the thing, and the thing that's much more important to me is what fundamental improvements are they making? Like what is fundamentally different? If they were, if showing the Gen 3 concept and not showing the vehicle, like, is so much more informative to me
yeah,
long term on the potential for the company than seeing, say a detailed render or even a prototype of a new car that they're going to manufacture in a year. Because if it's just a smaller car, like
yeah,
the potential for that long term is so much less than, hey, we rethought the factory and we're going to make the factory a lot cheaper. We're going to get the volume way up, and and on top of that, here's the reason to believe we're going to get to this cost point,
yeah,
right? Because if you understand manufacturing, if you understand engineering, you can look at this and you can see very easily that this, the potential that this offers for future vehicles.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I agree. I thought that my expectations going just before this was that their next generation platform would be this more incremental improvements,
Hmm.
changes, smaller car, just, get it down. But the investor day, that whole assembly manufacturing approach they're doing, modular, all that stuff, it really is like this, it's an aggressive, ambitious approach to completely rethink how it's made because there's some really probably super ambitious goals that they're trying to reach. If it was just kind of a little bit better, a little bit cheaper, whatever process is, then you wouldn't have to completely redesign everything. You just incrementally improve a little bit. But I thought, yeah, it's like extremely bullish in my opinion that it's a combination of there's a super ambitious goals, but also they've really rethought and came up with some really not just small incremental, but some
Yeah.
big,
Uh,
changes.
From my perspective, it was so much better than the best thing that I had imagined
Yeah,
that they were going to show us. I was really happy with it.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, it's interesting. I mean,
But not just, I mean, the way that all of Investor Day was structured, they basically, let's bring out each of our major groups. Let's give each one of them like, 20, 30 minutes to explain what they're doing. Like, I feel like they were generous with their time, but you could also imagine that, what if you had 2 days, or if you had 5 days, or if they brought up 20, it could just go indefinitely. I mean, from the perspective of like a public event, they might have gone long, but I also kinda got the impression that these guys, they're all just scraping the surface of what they've actually got going on. You didn't feel like, "There it is, that's everything we've been thinking about for the last 4 years." Just like, "Yeah, we went through our list of stuff, and we thought that maybe this was the most interesting thing that we could present," And we had 100 alternatives, but this is what we showed you. Like, I get the sense that there's a lot of depth behind what they're showing us. This is not like the whole thing.
yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah, and the other thing, like a few other things was interesting at the factory tour at Investor Day. They showed like different parts that I thought um, they were very cautious for people not to take pictures, but they wouldn't even let me take notes like on my phone. They're like, "Don't put away your phone." I was like, "Whoa, man, this is like the most cautious I've seen actually test out a factory tour." But um, like the motors and stuff, I felt like they're really trying to prepare for this, like make everything in house and get the cheapest, like their hairpin motors, and then with the batteries. I thought this was the thing that they're holding closest to their chest or vest or in a way, where they showed investors at Investor Day the dry electrode machines rolling, and the guy presenting or showing it, he seemed to be the head of the whole process, and he's saying like they're basically, in his words, rolling 24/7, and there's like almost no human involvement in the process, and they've got 5 machines going, and they've got their next generation coming soon, and it really was impressive, just this whole dry electrode and how much factory space they're saving. Um, and I just think that that's a huge part of this next gen vehicle too, where you have this battery factory that's just ridiculously small of a footprint compared to normal modern day battery factories at a very, super amazing cost point, and you combine that with these other things of a new assembly manufacturing approach, new factory layout and everything, and then you get this not just a small incremental improvement, but you get a big step change in terms of what you can deliver, for the price point.
Yeah, they're shooting for a point that's 5 years away,
Yeah.
right? There's like doing all this work and this manufacturing line and this production capability. It's really going to manifest over several years, and that's when it's really going to pay off. And between now and then, they're going to invest, 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 invest for a world that consumes like 1,000 times as much batteries as like. That's their picture. Like, what do we do to scale it at 1,000x from where they were a couple of years ago? And they're laying the groundwork for that. They're not trying to be profitable, or they're not trying to get factory product fit or factory market fit at each point as they go. It's not like, no, we're trying to fit our factory for that market, the market that we see 5 years ahead.
Yeah, at the end of the event, there was like some executives that you could go up to and talk with, and I was talking to one executive, and they're talking about Battery Day and how um, in I have to be a little bit cautious here, but they're saying, we had a timeline that we shared, and it's actually going almost exactly that we're following that timeline. The execution is going very, very well, even though someone or some people might have thought or said it would be faster, or it could be whatever in his opinion, or the timeline they originally had was the timeline that he was confident in. And so it gave me this interesting reassurance that they're really on track with their long-term projections, and um, they're not just throwing out a 10 or 20 million vehicle number out of the hat. They understand how cheap the vehicle needs to get to reach a certain market, and how compelling the vehicle needs to be as well. And they have this, on all the fronts how to get there, and they're very focused on going with that. And it's um yeah, with batteries, with manufacturing, and all the machinery that goes along with the manufacturing, it's a complex process. Um yeah, you've got to, in order to compete with that, you've got to match Tesla at that level of focus and innovation engineering, and that's going to be tough.
Yeah, there are no incumbents. I mean, incumbents are dedicated to trying to minimize the changes to the business model, right? They've optimized their business for that. So, you know, they're going to get in innovators dilemmaed, right? And it's almost unavoidable. And strangely, if you read Christensen's book on the topic, right? It's actually really hard. It's not that they can't do it because they're dumb or because they're not well managed or whatnot. It's that they're like in this local maxima, and the opportunity they have to go so far down the hill in order to get to the next mountain, that from an kind of investment business management standpoint, it just doesn't make sense for them to do that. And that's why companies don't cross that threshold to the next mountain. They die and something else happens. So, and that's just what's going to happen. You touched on something which I think is super important to keep in mind for us outside of Tesla who are trying to understand what the company is doing, is that especially around companies like Tesla, where you've got so much chatter going on outside, there are narratives that just get going and they take on a life of their own, and they can be completely false, but they get repeated enough and whatnot. So, for instance, the notion that the 4680 or the dry battery electrode process isn't going well, and it's behind schedule, and they're having to do all these other things to adjust it, And once you hear that narrative, you start seeing confirmations and all the little decisions the company makes, like they're not saying this, they're not saying that, this must be why. And there's just more and more of that confirmation bias over time, because outside, so little information comes out about this process that you know, the outside world becomes utterly convinced of something, which is completely false because of that feedback loop. But we're probably more wrong than we are right when we try to read these things externally.
Yeah. I had this thought of just talking about chatter or um, around, let's say, Tesla's products or timelines. I think there's something about human nature where we tend to lean on hope or fear, like where we think it's, oh no, Tesla's sandbagging everything. It's going to be much better than expected. Or it's like this fear. It's like, oh my gosh, like, it's like way behind. And um, I think there's something where there's a natural just leaning on one side or the other. Um, so I see that often. And um,
Yeah, it's kind of too bad. I mean, luckily, we have different points of view to try to bring us back to
yeah,
it. So you can't get too far down your road. I mean, assuming that you're not totally locking yourself in a bubble, there will be somebody outside who will point out the obvious flaws in your fantasy of doom or ecstasy or whatever is going on.
yeah,
Thankfully,
yeah. Um, yeah, interesting stuff. What do you think about this next gen vehicle paint? Do you think it's going to be just traditional paint, or do you think it's going to be
I
stainless
think
steel?
the idea. Well, so there's if you think about some of the constraints that the new process introduces, right? I mean, one of the reasons that they assemble the body in white and paint it and then disassemble it. I mean, there are a couple of things. One is it's made out of stamped steel, which is subject to corrosion. Like they pick a metal not for its corrosion properties, but for its structural properties and its ability to do welds and use fasteners and that kind of stuff. And then, so by decoupling, for regular steel, by decoupling the material choice from the need for, excuse me, from the need for corrosion resistance, you solve corrosion resistance with paint after the fact. So if they go with stainless, and they could do stamped stainless, you can do that just by going thinner. Like you don't have to do Cybertruck stainless. But if they go with stainless, they free the vehicle from those constraints where we have to paint all of the metal because you've got to have corrosion resistance long term, or it has to be treated somehow. So, like if they decide to go with stainless steel, that does give them more options because they don't have to do the dipping, the treating, the painting all as a single body. And then if you paint it, you want to put the whole thing together because it's so hard to match paint like really, really well. Like if the door is the slightest tint different than the surrounding body, like it'll really pop out to your eye in bright light. And that's why they have to put the whole car together and then paint it as a unit and then disassemble it. If you try to paint the doors separately, you're definitely going to run into that. So what if you don't paint the doors, right? Well, that's an obvious fix for that kind of stuff. So stainless steel definitely enables this. It seems to me, going with stainless steel. And for color, I mean, people have talked about, well, maybe wraps, maybe a factory wrap is an option, or maybe they do stainless. So like I find that's really interesting. I haven't spent a lot of time. I did go look at whether you could stamp stainless and like what some of the constraints were. And there are things like texturing the metal, which are kind of an issue, and then stainless steel, it can become less stainless depending on the blend that you use after you form it or heat it, or some of the things that you might do to build a body out of stainless in a conventional way, like that could happen. So I don't know all the details on that, and the details really matter. But the idea that it could be stainless, I think, is really interesting, and that would be another big. Apparently, the DeLorean was stamped stainless, so there's at least one existence proof that you can get away with that. So I like that idea. And that it's compelling enough that I have a hard time now getting back to the idea. I'm getting in my little loop of like, that's great. They must be doing that.
Yeah, I would love to see some like stainless steel, just because if you can get rid of the paint shop and all that, that'd be amazing. Um, it just takes up so much time and just
It's it's the most expensive part of the factory, I've heard. Um, and one of the biggest parts of the factory. It really takes up a lot of space.
yeah,
It's a huge constraint because you have to wait for the paints to cure, you have to bake them, and then it's a huge QA like overhead because there's so much of the inspection process is making sure you got the paint right and there aren't any dings. And you can imagine also as a QA thing at the tail end, right? That paint defects, that's got to be one of the number one, delivery day complaints that that they get and that they have to deal with. So maybe customer satisfaction goes up, and maybe the amount of like touch up work or rework or whatever that you have to do at the tail end, maybe that comes way down too.
Yeah.
So seems like there's, but at the end of the day, can you do it with the materials? Are the materials cost effective? Do you get the structural targets that you need? I don't know the answer to that.
I mean, my big question mark would be stainless steel. Is that look going to be mass appeal for 10 or 20 million vehicles? That level, because there seems to be a precedent for this certain shape and look of cars painted, rounded. Um,
Yeah, it's utility, it has a beauty all its own, right? So like knowing that your paint isn't going to get scratched and you don't have to worry about door dings or less. Um, knowing if the wrap thing ends up working, like I don't know a lot about wraps. I know good wraps are relatively expensive, and that to really do a good wrap, you kind of have to disassemble the car. I was wondering, like, how would you change the design of a car if you were going to design it for wrapping, and if you were to automate wrapping, like in a factory, could you do it a lot better? Would it be faster? Those are all really interesting questions, but like wraps, that's an interesting potential for, having a stainless car and then also having, some variants on it that you can do. Because, imagine the base, if the stainless car is $3,000, $4,000 less than a wrapped car, well, that's another kind of way you can get to an even lower price point and still have some product differentiation. So you have some markup on your colored vehicles, right?
that's true. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, yeah, that's not bad. I mean, it'd be easier to do that than having like two separate models, like a stainless steel and a painted model. Um, yeah, that seems more complex, but yeah, we'll see. Um, yeah, interesting. So recently Tesla's been doing a bunch of price cuts on their vehicles. What's your thoughts? There's people who are clamoring, saying that Tesla should advertise instead of cutting their prices. Do you have any kind of thoughts or, are you swayed in any direction?
Uh, so I don't Tesla's got insane amounts of information. They have more information than OEMs tend to have, right? Because they have all the way down to the customer interface. Um, I think they probably understand their business really well. What it takes to incentivize people to buy cars, and where they're doing well, where they're not doing well, what people do and don't understand. I don't think they have perfect knowledge, but I think as the car business goes, they're probably pretty well informed. And externally, like I haven't seen sources of information which I think remotely rival the information that Tesla has to work from in making these kinds of decisions. So I'm super reluctant to second guess them. Um, the I don't I it, I understand the from the kind of a shorter term investment standpoint, how you might want to see them keep their margins up, and you might think, well, if they advertise to push up demand, they can't sell any more cars than they can make. They're selling all the cars that they do make, so they won't sell more cars. We could sell them at a higher price. Do you get the money back from advertising? I don't really know. Like I did a quick cut at like what it costs to advertise cars enough to make a difference in sales. And my general sense is that, there's a decent chance it turns out to be a wash, and it might be negative, it might be positive, but I didn't see when I did a quick, kind of napkin analysis of it, that there was a clear win there, that you definitely would increase profitability of the company by going with advertising and trying to keep prices high. Also, looking at the longer term arc of the business, I mean, like the model I built of Tesla in my 10-year model that I built a couple of years back, it actually had the cars getting crazy, crazy cheap over time. Like there's this, well, first of all, you have to get really cheap. I mean, you've the curves of market penetration by price, or the TAM by vehicle price variation. It pretty clearly shows that the bread and butter of like the model, even the lower end 3 and Y, they're above the meat of that. Like there's so much TAM that you can get to if you can get the price down. They have to get the prices down. They have to come down. Um, do you get down there by, like, keeping the price on the 3 and the Y and coming out with a new vehicle? I think a lot of, commentary has been from people who think that that's the right path forward for the company, like, keep the 3Y, try to keep the margins high and that kind of stuff. If you want a lower price point vehicle, come out with one, get differentiation. It's a pretty classic view. There's a lot of data to support that. But, uh, I like the disruptive thing. Like, no, 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 we're going to make all the cars cheaper. I mean, electric vehicles, they're just going to be better. They're going to be cheaper. And the margin's going to be high because the technology is fundamentally better. We, like, I can see the argument both ways, but personally, I'm a fan of driving the prices down. I think if, like, I'm super happy to see them maintain 15 or 20% margins on the cars and grow as fast as they can, like, if that's the trade-off. If it went lower, like, I mean, I feel like if they had to go down to, like, super skinny margins in order to maintain their growth rate, I would still do that. Like, 'cause I think growth is way more important than profitability at this point, especially because they've got such a good cash cushion.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, also with FSD, if that becomes a reality with robotaxi, that's going to add to margins. So that's on top of just,
Yeah.
the hardware.
No, it's you could sell the cars at a loss. I mean, seriously. It if we see FSD in a robotaxi form come to market in the next few years, you give the cars away because their car is gonna be a rounding error on the value of FSD.
Yeah. I think with me, with advertise or the price cuts and advertising, I lean on just with price cuts to drive demand over advertising. If you're able to do it, and you have the margins to support it. I think, yeah, I tend to just give the benefit of doubt to Tesla management on this issue. I think they know what they're doing. I also think there's this hidden value that if you let in advertising and you start to use it, you could start to, it could be like advertising creep where you start to use it more and more and more. And now it's this balance thing of how do you drive demand? Oh, you innovate and you advertise. And it's this two thing. I think right now with Elon's kind of focus, if you kind of kick out advertising, you say, we're going to drive down the price purely off of innovation. We have to engineer our way through this. It's this forced focus where it can have some very, I think, intangible benefits where the entire culture is really like sink or swim. This we're gonna make this happen. I think once you start to bring in more and more advertising, it could be, I don't know, longer term. There's risk of perhaps becoming a little bit less hardcore. Innovation is the only thing that's gonna drive our company forward. But I actually think though, that said, I think advertising in smart ways is smart. Like for example, I think the first, I don't know how many millions you spend, maybe 10, 20, 50, 100, I don't know what that is per quarter or year. You're going to have a huge return on your investment because it's like, it's this,
Right. Like most
it's,
things,
yeah,
right? The
it's,
low-hanging fruit
exactly.
is in the early
Yeah.
investment. Yeah.
I think some of the things you could advertise is, for example, the charging network, the supercharging network, also the battery longevity, um, all this stuff where there's a big still perhaps bias or concern of people who don't buy a car. Because, for example, my neighbor, he looked at me the other day and he's like, "Oh, you guys have two Teslas." I'm like, "Yeah, we've had it for a while." And he's like, "How do you get by with two?" It's like he's so shocked because he thinks you need a icy car as a backup or something. And that is I'm like, "Yeah, we get by fine." It's like all our local driving is done, and there's tons of superchargers, and when we take a trip, there's, like, no problem at all, but in his mind, it's inconceivable. But if you can address that, the charging issue, local and travel, superchargers, all that, battery longevity, with education, I think you get a big bang for your buck with that, and
But it is essentially gonna be like, let's try to increase demand so that the lead times get longer and the prices go up. Like, that's a trade-off, right? Because it's not like, "Oh, we got more demand, we can build another factory." They're already building factories as fast as they can.
well, I think the reason or the rationale is at least keep the prices not to sink so fast, so quickly. You know what I'm saying? Like if you're having to decrease the prices continuously to drive demand, at least maybe you can decrease it less drastically because demand is being, supported by some advertising, or I would call it more educational advertising, and focus on
But
specific
once again,
issues.
the trade-off is short-term profitability, right? It's like this quarter, next quarter, we make a few more bucks than we would have made otherwise because we do this thing where we change the philosophy of the company and right. Um,
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I think with educational advertising, like charging, it could be a long-term thing too, because you're like, in order to have adoption long term, people have to understand what this is and how to use it and what the benefits are. Um, so, I mean, I think to date, Tesla has relied on more word of mouth and the cars. I mean, the cars driving on the streets themselves, that's a huge advertising impact because you're constantly seeing these cars on the road, reminding of them. You see your friends driving them, and then your friends can tell you. But then there's a certain limit where perhaps in certain circles, you don't have a lot of people who are driving Teslas, in certain neighborhoods or, places or types of people. And so, yeah, to reach those people just purely word of mouth, yeah, it could
well,
be,
making the cars cheaper gets
yeah,
you into new places you weren't. There's also, I mean, when you look at all of the sort of uh, false understandings that people have that might hold people back from thing. There's all the classic EV ones, but there's some that just surround Tesla also, which is like they're super expensive. Like that's still a huge chunk of the population thinks they're. And for in people who actually have been in the EV buying space, one of the myths about Tesla is, well, it's really long lead time. If I want, my choice is I can go get a Chevy Bolt off the dealer lot, or I can wait 4 months to get my Tesla or whatnot. If you keep the prices high and you keep the lead times long, well, you're more and more entrenching those perspectives that it's an expensive, hard to get car. And at some point that hurts you, right? Because you do want that to change. I mean, there's a certain sort of market penetration you get to where you want the people who want to walk into a dealer, drive the car around a little bit, and then put the money down and walk out with their car. Like that's a segment of the market that Tesla doesn't really get right now, right?
yeah, yeah. All right, so moving on to FSD. So the big news, which I haven't even talked to you about since it happened, which is hardware 4 going into the cars. Um, we were hoping that it would be retrofittable, but now it appears that it's not going to be retrofittable.
Doesn't look to me.
Yeah. So, what's going to happen, you think?
It's just speaking broadly, they could decide to make a version of hardware 4 that was retrofittable. I mean, it's mainly a silicon change. When I got to see, I saw Green the Only posted some photos and I looked at those and I pulled some chip numbers off because I was really curious about what we can learn about what's going on. The FSD sock itself is changed. It's a bigger package, and there's twice as many DRAM chips, and they've gone from a relatively power efficient low speed DRAM to like the fastest DRAM that you can get in a cost effective thing, and they've doubled the memory width. So my back of the napkin on this is they've increased the memory bandwidth by 6.5 times, and this significantly increases the power draw that the module needs. So I think that probably the dominant reason why it's not retrofittable is they decided to go to a much faster memory architecture, which caused the power envelope to go up, and the amount of power that you can deliver in the existing vehicle just isn't enough for the architecture that they wanted. They had a target spec. If they decided that they really wanted to make a retrofittable version, they could spin another version of the silicon, change the memory footprint, and get kind of an intermediate thing. So it's not like the ship has sailed on hardware 4 and that there's no possibility for a hardware 3 improvement. They could do another one. It wouldn't be that big a deal. They've got millions of cars out there. Like there's like 2 million cars that could bear upgrading. And that might be something that makes sense for them. I was kind of surprised that they decided not to have hardware 4 be upgradable. On the other hand, if you really think hardware 3 is good enough, you don't need to upgrade it. It's expensive, it's complicated, it's inconvenient for the users. The better thing is to just deliver software that works on hardware 3. I mean, that's the win-win. And if they're pretty confident they can do that, then hardware 4 doesn't solve any problems for them, right? We talked before, the silicon's going to keep getting better. It just is. The hardware is just going to get better. We're going to know more about it. So it's going to get cheaper and cheaper to make better and better platforms. So yeah, just like everything else, why wouldn't you make a better version 3 years down the road, 4 years down the road? Because you can do that and save money at the same time. So that was inevitably going to happen. The presumption that they would make it backward compatible, I think for me was a component of a big component of that was thinking, well, more compute is always useful. I mean, you can always produce a better experience with more compute. But there's this other sort of component of it that I wasn't thinking about, which is like once you've got enough hardware in there to deliver what you need to deliver for the audience that you want to go to, then anything else that you do it's just gravy. It's not necessarily creating value for that. So maybe that's where we are. And as I mentioned at the start of that, if they decided that they really needed a hardware upgrade, they could probably quadruple and stay inside the same power envelope if they decide they want to do that.
So you're thinking if if the 2 million or so of existing vehicles needed an upgrade, they could make a separate.
They could build a separate container. They could do, I mean, you can repackage the silicon, and instead of having two banks of that memory, you go to one bank. Instead of doubling the memory width, you could put half of it in, and you could significantly bring the power envelope down. So I think they're gonna, hardware 4 is, I think, just based on the memory bandwidth, it would be a 6.5x speed up if that was the only thing going on. But if they're taking advantage of any architectural improvements on top of that, it's probably 10, might be 20. So it seemed like they decided that for the next one, if we're going to do another hardware design, let's just go long. Let's go for like overwhelming, huge amounts of compute power.
I mean, if they did a separate retrofittable, hardware 4 type of, thing, but it had less, let's say, memory and less power draw, would they have to have two separate neural nets they deployed basically on these
Yeah.
two versions of
But they
the
already do
hardware?
different versions for different vehicles. So
Okay. I mean, it seems like the longer term, that's like a headache, to maintain and push
yeah.
forward.
But I mean, it's not as big a headache as being unable to fulfill the promise you made to 2 million buyers, right?
That's true. Yeah. I mean, I think that's an issue. I mean, because you bought FSD saying like with this promise or this expectation that the feature will be complete. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's a tough one.
Yeah, I thought you were going to lead off with FSD 11, which is
Yeah.
actually seeing FSD v11 on the car now. It it make it it's a really significant improvement. I've been really happy with it.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask, what with FSD 11, what are the main kind of improvements or things you've
Well, let
noticed?
me tie it back to the other point
Okay.
before we move on to it,
Yeah.
and that is like I look at that and I see progress. I see really solid progress toward delivering, robotaxi capable level of FSD on the existing vehicles on hardware 3. And so, it gives me confidence that they're going to get there on hardware 3. And so that initial interpretation that, yeah, probably no need a hardware 4. Like this is, I mean, it's hard to see it as a bullish sign because this is one of those narratives that we outside had gotten into, like hardware 4, we'll go from 3 to 4 to 5. All the cars will get upgraded. And it didn't go that way. And now it's like, our external take on it is, oh, is something wrong? But you can read this exactly the opposite. You can say, wow, things are going great. No more hardware upgrades are ever going to be needed. They're super confident. And that's why with hardware 4, they're just going someplace else because hardware 3 is done. FSD 11. Yeah, I'm super happy with it.
It's an interesting thing. I mean, that's an interesting point because you assume most people would assume FSD is a software problem, but also a hardware component, and they play like major components. But if you make more of the assumption that it's largely and mostly like predominantly a software issue, that if you can solve the software issue um, in an exceedingly great manner, it can run on probably hardware that's less, let's
As the
say,
software gets better and
perform.
better, I mean, right now, the easiest way to make progress is you get a faster computer and you just make the neural networks bigger and you train on more data or whatever the deal is. But long term, like as the technique continues to get better, like delivering FSD, delivering a full robotaxi FSD, the requirements are going to go down, right? Like as it gets mature, like hardware through will be plenty. That I'd said before that, the previous GPU that they had, which is like 5 or 10x less capable than hardware 3, like at some point FSD will run on that and it will work, right? Like whether there will be enough of those cars to make it worthwhile and they'll still be on the road and that kind of stuff, when that those are all open questions. But as the technology gets good, the hardware requirements go down to deliver a particular set of function that might be that our standards will go up, right? I mean, once you really start getting robotaxis out there, we may find that society's tolerance for accidents goes way down. After we have very low tolerance for airline accidents. But 100 years ago, we had really high tolerance for airline accidents because it was just part of flying in airplanes, was that they fell out of the sky sometimes. So right now, we're super tolerant of car accidents, and there's so many problems that we get really wound up about that don't involve killing 40,000 and wounding like 1 million people in the United States every year. Uh, but we just ignore it. And it could be that once those numbers start going down, we start to, it sinks in like how horrifying this thing is that we've all gotten used to. And then if our tolerance goes down, it might be that any car that's not incredibly safe is something the public just doesn't want to have on the road.
Yeah. I mean, like when you compare it to like large language models, um, like I did this one interview with this guy who took Facebook's Llama model and yeah, GPT-4, put it, on your MacBook Air. And, as these models, like for example, let's say GPT, let's say 3.5, it can't run on a MacBook Air because it just isn't, it's a large model. It's just not, if as efficiently yeah, exactly, efficiently designed. Like in the future, like a model like that probably could run on a laptop if because there's so much inefficiency in terms of the size and of like it's just these models are huge and they don't necessarily have to be huge if we figure out what's
That
really
that's a 7 billion parameter model that's delivered in a 4.2 gigabyte file, right? So it's quantized down to 4 bits, and it's running on a CPU. Like, this is based on I'll butcher the guy's name, Georgy Garaganov. It's like this alpha hacker went out and he wrote a bunch of optimizers to basically, so you could squeeze these LLMs down and you could run them on, these various platforms, including CPUs. Like you can get a CPU version of this. And so it runs in a tiny fraction of the memory it was designed to run on. And it runs in a tiny fraction of the compute power it was designed to run on because somebody sat down and optimized it. And that's kind of where we are. I mean, there's been so much focus on raising the level of capability and getting them to run efficiently on large data centers. Like training efficiency has gotten a significant amount of attention, but this inference efficiency that you get like when you run your laptop, it's really got, relatively speaking, very little attention. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there, and these things can be significantly. And the other thing is, I mean, a lot of these models that are getting trained right now, they're getting what are called chinchilla optimized, which is that they're designed to give you the most performance for your training budget. But of course, when you look at the whole life cycle of a model, you running it in the field is way more important than how much it costs. Like if you double your training cost, but you have your inference costs for most applications, that's a huge win. So the thing is the chinchilla, the chinchilla optimized, the inference version of chinchilla optimal, those models are much smaller because you do things like distillation, you do quantization on them. There are all of these techniques that we know that work that can make inference run in a small fraction of the resources that these models take. Just the research models or the first cut models. OpenAI is probably doing that with ChatGPT because they're trying to scale it up. But at the same time, we have hints that they put maybe 1,000 times as much training into ChatGPT as they put into the GPT-3 models, or sorry, GPT-4 into the GPT-3 models, and that's expensive today, right? So to some extent, they have to optimize for training because training is still so expensive. But as they scale the market, as they get more and more users on this stuff, that calculus changes, and they'll start working harder on that, and the footprint required to run these things will come down. So yeah. ChatGPT 3, GPT-3 Chat GPT 3.5 equivalent models running on laptops, like that's not like that is totally feasible.
Yeah.
That could totally, and Apple could go out and decide they just want to put a bigger neural engine in the, because I think they're running 11 teraflops right now, but that was just, you look at the silicon map for the IC, and they're not actually dedicating that much. That's just where they thought, that's the most we need right now. They could do much better if they wanted to.
Yeah. I mean, all of this tying back to hardware fours, it's what do you think? Is it a possibility like Tesla on their newest hardware four, they release their latest, versions that require all that, but 6 to 12 months later, they can release on, let's say this modified hardware four for retrofitted vehicles, they can release a smaller, more efficient model that's almost the same capabilities as the slightly larger model onto these retrofittable hardware 4 cars. And so then at least you have some, you bring these older cars
I
into,
mean, there's good reason to continue improving the hardware 3 versions of the neural networks. And as FSD was developing, AP actually kept getting better. Even though you could argue AP was good enough a while back, they learned things, and they built tools and whatnot that were helping a lot with the FSD implementations. They would fold that back into AP, and AP would get better too, because you know by pushing by pushing the limit on one system, they learn stuff that basically makes it very low cost to significantly improve the non-bleeding edge system. So, AP, which wasn't the bleeding edge, version of the self-driving software that Tesla had, it continues to improve, and a significant amount of that is coming from the fact that they're pushing really hard on. So you would likely see something like if they if they can build and deploy much bigger neural networks on hardware 4 that are much more resource intensive and get them out into the field, they will learn things that are relevant to making the hardware 3. So you're going to continue to see the networks on hardware 3 getting better and better, after hardware 4 comes out. And maybe in large part because hardware 4 is enabling them to do things, to learn things at scale in the field that they wouldn't have learned on hardware 3 because it has reduced edge capabilities.
got it. When do you think when do you think if someone wants to test out the latest and the greatest FSD, um,
When would you get the hardware 4 car?
yeah,
Yeah, and
because
I've been thinking about this myself.
I'm
Probably
thinking
right around the time I get my Cybertruck, which is probably like 2 years from now.
really, 'cause I'm thinking it's gonna take a while before they will release stuff that you know needs this hardware for over the hardware 3. It's not gonna be
When
quick.
hardware
So
3 came out, it was a good year plus, maybe 18 months after it came out before it was before it was an improvement over the hardware 2.5 cars. Yeah, maybe 2 years. I mean, it took a while for that to happen, and it'll probably be faster with hardware 4 because, they've got so much more infrastructure for doing this, and because a lot of the underlying, structure of the way that they approach a problem doesn't need to change. Uh, but yeah, I would expect, it'll be a year or more before. Yeah, I'm just guessing, obviously, and because it's possible they've been working on this in the back room for 3 years and it's almost ready to go. But that wouldn't be Tesla style, right? I'm expecting like it'll be a year before the hardware 4 cars catch up to the hardware 3 cars.
Huh, interesting. So with the current hardware 4 cars, are they? I guess they're just run. Are they running the same exact kind of neural nets, or is it different?
I haven't looked at them. I don't really know. It's I chatted with Grain a little bit about this, trying to get some insight into what might be going on, and there's just it seems like the general compute infrastructure is pretty similar. They didn't do a radical departure, but they have probably, like I would guess, they added more instructions to the neural engine that they didn't have before. They might have support for various techniques for getting more for less in there. Maybe they have 4-bit quantization, like that would be a big win. We now know, we didn't know at the time that they were doing hardware 3 that 4-bit quantization would be a big win. But right now it looks like it is a real significant. So like if you're building a chip today, you would put support for that in for sure. There are other things that they could have rolled in. They might have made the multipliers bigger. There's all kinds of things that they could be doing, but we just don't have much insight into what's going on in there right now.
Yeah, interesting. Actually, tangent on Apple because we talked about MacBook a bit. Um, do you think they're getting close to releasing something like maybe a WWDC, uh, like on device LLM, like that you could interact with?
That GPT-4 all type stuff, like people make versions of that run on iPhones now. It's the neural coprocessor that they have in the MacBook M1 that like when you were running GPT-4 all, if you were running the M1 version of it, like it's doing most of the inference on that neural processor. Well, that neural processor is exactly the same neural processor they have in the phones. And so like if you look at the hackers who are like making the small versions of the model and tweaking them, they very frequently, will take the model right off of the laptop and then, you do some tweaks and you run it on the phone and it runs fine. I mean, in fact, I think somebody took, Georgie's like a first cut at that and put it on their phone and it was running faster than it was on their MacBook Air. And they were like, why is the latency on the phones, shorter than but yeah, so they already have good support for doing stuff at the scale of the models that's out there. Could it get better? It could. The latency is still like, I think if you want to run like that GPT-4 Hall equivalent model on your phone, it has a latency of like 700 milliseconds or something like that. So that's pretty slow for like if you're putting a lot, because that's 700 milliseconds per token, right? But so they could decide that they want to scale that up and run LLMs on the phone. I wouldn't be surprised if we see them running language models on the phone really soon because
I mean, that seems like a huge uh, jump forward for AI once you have these large language models on your phone, um, and just improving very, very fast every year. I think it's going to surprise
the
a lot of
landscape
people.
is changing so fast right now that if you're talking about like making a commitment to like changing a chip architecture, something like that, you'd be pretty nervous about like trying to do anything that was specific to the LLM thing because it could really change a lot in the next 6 months. And we're likely to see more shocking developments. And we're not going to see less. We're going to see more shocking developments. People are just starting to get around to applying these LLMs in novel ways. Because that whole, you talk to the LLM, you prompt it, and it gives you something back. I mean, obviously, plugging LLMs into, like the Wolfram Alpha thing, where you have a plugin on the back end, or building an app on the front end that uses the LLM as a back end to do something, which is what Copilot is doing at GitHub. But there's so many. I mean, like there's an uncountable number of things you could do with them in 2 weeks, in 4 weeks, in 6 weeks to do that. And so some space of those is going to get implemented and we're going to learn things. People are starting to do stuff where they have LLMs use other LLMs and talk back and forth between multiple LLMs. Or they have, you do multiple cycles to the thing where, you have a process, you want to do planning. So you run the planning through the LLM and then you take that and you break that down and then you have the LLM, provide suggestions for each of the, you can decompose problems with some existence from external heuristic software and use an LLM as a utility. And there's so many possibilities in there. It's just nutty. And people have barely started looking at those. So we're going to see so much creative use of these things over the next 6 months. And then, so a year from now, what Apple would see as the potential for applying these things in the phone is the landscape is going to look different than it is today. It'll be a large superset. So like everything that seems like an opportunity today, well, that'll still be an opportunity in a year, but there may be other even more appealing opportunities a year from now that you maybe want to put your resources into.
Interesting. Like what are some examples of these possible
Man,
opportunities?
I mean, it's been interesting to watch the creative use of the LLMs, but a thing that's going to happen for sure over the next year is we're going to see people start going multimodal. Like language models have been trained mainly on language. GPT-4, they have images as an alternative input. But there are a lot of other things that could potentially be inputs in to these things. We've only really started looking at that. I think most people expect that the capability and the efficiency of these models is going to significantly improve when we get multiple, but we don't know exactly what that's going to be. When GPT-3 came out and we got zero-shot learning, like that was a surprise. It was this emergent property. Um, RLHF on ChatGPT-3, it's an interesting observation about ChatGPT-3 is it's not actually more capable than GPT-3 is. Like all the core capabilities are basically the same. It's just that they figured out how to get it to cooperate with you. Because if it's just like complete my sentence, right, you got to figure out, you have to have these pretty elaborate preambles to get just the kind of, completion that you want. There's a lot of clever tricks that you can do, but you don't get the level of, anybody can use it sort of amazing functionality that you get with ChatGPT-3 until you teach it about instructions, which is what Instruct GPT did. And that's what the fine tuning phase of ChatGPT does. And until you give it a sense of what does the human want to hear versus talking to me. And that's what the RLHF has. So it's shocking how much improvement they got in the behavior of the language model because the language model's core capabilities didn't change. You just changed its biases, essentially. And that's what they did with that. And GPT-4, it does have significantly extended capabilities compared to and I think we're just, everybody's rate limited on being able to use GPT-4 right now. So nobody's doing these huge experiments the way you can do with GPT 3.5 right now. I think there's a lot of potential just in pushing that forward. It's going to be really interesting when we start getting to use images. Because that whole thing about you take a picture of a tax form and you're like, fill this out for me. Or you take a picture, like any form you can take a photograph of, you can feed into, and you can get a textual, there's so much paperwork type stuff in the world, which has been resistant to getting transitioned to digital. And all of that, I mean, it remains to be seen because very few people have access to this, but that looks like a capability that GPT-4 is it's just right on the threshold of like zero shot automating all of the paperwork in the world, like introducing it. Like that's so big, right? And it's one of like 1,000 things that could, anyway, multimodal. Yeah. So the Palm 562 model that Google did, where they, essentially they took a vision model, VIT22, and they plugged it into their existing Palm model, and they're like, now let's have it drive a robot, right? Like it's I mean, from the researcher standpoint, maybe it's not so shocking. The thing is, it works, right? They were totally able to abstract the planning function of the robot, and planning for robots is hard in the real world, right? But they got vision, they got the planning, they got a certain amount of real world understanding and planning capability that they just got from the language model, because apparently language models learn that if they learn enough of this stuff. So a whole space of really difficult robotics problems just got abstracted away by the language model, right? And there are probably a lot more of those out there that we just haven't found yet. I don't know. I'm speaking in the abstract. It's hard to come up with concrete things because the space is so large.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, you talked about a lot of interesting things here. So, um, yeah, multimodal like LLMs, it just seems like that's going to extend the capability of these LLMs tremendously. In like, because right now, what we're doing was just typing in text. Like, that's just, we're going to look at that as just so, I don't want to say so archaic, but it's just going to be, it's the way we interact with these LLMs are going to be completely transformed.
Voice is a perfectly reasonable input to an LLM, and we train them on text models right now. But there's lots and lots and lots of audio in the world, right? Yeah. And like you can just take audio and plug it into the model and do really similar things with. I mean, the right way to do it today is to make a multimodal model that takes voice input or sound input in addition to text. Like you cross those two over, and now you've got a speech. You're an LLM, a sequence. We call them language models because we trained them on language, but the architecture is much more general than that. We learned when we started putting pictures into it, and when we started asking it to like drive our robots around, right? We discovered that it's not just language. Like this architecture works. We call them language models because we started with language. But putting voice is another kind of language, but there's so much more information that comes in voice. I mean, in the real world, language is a voice phenomenon, right? Intonation, pacing. There's so much more information in voice than is in the text we transcribe it to, which is one of the reasons why text speech is so much more flowery. You're trying to make up for everything you lose when you come away from the audio. Well, give the machine the audio now. Like GPT-3, it really struggles to know what words rhyme because in English, it's not a phonetic. But, you give it voice, it's super obvious, right? All kinds of things that it really struggles to understand are going to be so obvious and easily accessible to the model when we give it voice. And then on top of that, you're just not going to type anymore. You're just going to talk to the machine because it's going to so level up voice interfaces when they do that. And that's another, I'm going to call it an obvious application. Like, it's not easy. It's going to take resources to do it. There's got to be people working on it right now. And when it rolls out, it's going to be shocking
Yeah.
in the same way ChatGPT was.
Yeah, I think it's gonna shock a lot of people because I was driving in the car yesterday with my wife. I'm like, um, I forget what the conversation. We were talking about AI almost every day, like, but I'm saying like, I was saying something like, oh yeah, it's gonna be a while before robots take over the job of an electrician or a plumber or um, they're it's it's harder. But then I'm like, yeah, just like it's gonna be a while. Oh, we're talking about how some AI experts are saying AGI is decades away still, and some of the most renowned AI experts are saying it's still decades away. I'm like, it could be partially definition where they think AGI is not just smarter in most tasks, but smarter like in almost every task, including physical tasks. If you have that type of definition, maybe you're still thinking, decades away. So I was like, yeah, maybe there's a lining of truth that, yeah, for humans, for a robot or AI to be smarter than a human in terms of how to do some complicated physical, skill. Yeah, sure, maybe we are a while away. And then my next thought was like, yeah, just like, we're talking next to each other, just like it's gonna be a while before AI is going to be able to do all of the nuances of the voice where you can't tell it's a AI. Humans have so much more expression in their voice. I'm like, just like it's gonna take a while. Then I listened to myself. I'm like, wait a minute, maybe it's not gonna take a while because once they've got the data, yeah, once they got the data, it's just gonna be like so fast. They're gonna pick up all of the nuances, the volume, the intonation, all that meaning. Where before we know it, like AI is gonna be able to speak in a way we can't tell it's an AI. But that's gonna shock a lot of people because right now, voice of a computer or voice of AI is just this monotone. It's like blah 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 blah. It doesn't have that.
Like people building models out there that mimic humans and are essentially indistinguishable from human beings.
I mean, I haven't found something that's really like I can't tell the difference. It's still like I could noticeably tell, but I think it's gonna shock a lot of people when you hear something, and not just when you hear something, when you converse with something that doesn't have latency, you can't tell the difference, and you're doing a 30-minute conversation, and you're just like that's gonna freak out.
And the whole, doing a avatar, so there's a face you look at on your
Yeah.
computer and it's got expressions and all that kind of stuff. Like, that's coming along great. That'll probably come a little bit later, but just because it's more hardware resource intensive, right? So running it on consumer stuff will take a little bit longer, but the capability to do that it's doing great. Yeah, yeah, boy, it's just nutty. I have spent so much time staring at the ceiling in the middle of the night lately thinking about this.
A funny story. So I'm showing my one of the things I do is I show my kids all the stuff that I'm doing, but also so I'm creating a lot of um, like language learning content, and um, and I'm really like GPT 3.5. It couldn't do what I needed it to do exactly. Like I would have to run things like 10 times to get one thing I really liked. Um, but GPT-4 is like 8 or 9 out of 10 times it's getting it. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like I could tell how big of a step up based upon how much it could do, what I'm pushing it to do. But I'm showing my kids all this stuff, but along the way, so they're seeing the changes too. And I'm showing my kids also like images like Midjourney and other things. And so they're seeing all the versions and how it's improving. And I'm introducing like multimodal, like what GPT-4 is going to be able to do and all this stuff. And my 8-year old is so funny. He just intuitively gets some stuff where he's like, um, he kind of knows what companies he connects the dots and he's like, oh, that means this company or this company is going to go bankrupt. So we have these apps on our phone where we're able to like take a picture of a plant or a flower and it tells us the flower, the plant, but oftentimes it's wrong. It's not the greatest thing, but sometimes it's right and we like it. And I was using the app and he's like, that's gonna go bankrupt. That's gonna go bankrupt. I'm like, I'm thinking about it, I'm like, oh yeah, it will go bankrupt just because when you stick an LLM, like you stick a multimodal like language model and you give it a picture, it's gonna be so much more accurate than an old school whatever app that's trying to do all these things, to determine what
Yeah,
a plant is.
in the same way that a cell phone sort of, the cell phone absorbed all these devices into it, and everybody's just got a cell phone. Like, I mean, we keep talking about language models. These LLMs, you get a multimodal LLM with a camera in, especially if it's got direct voice or something like, it's just going to absorb a plethora of separate applications that we do right now. Like, I'm fascinated by the possibility that you will just tell ChatGPT to do your taxes, right? Like it's GPT-4, right? Like here are the forms. You get your bank statement. Here are I mean, it's a little hyperbolic the description, but you know, I mean, taxes are a pain in the butt and they've been hard and there's no good reason for it, really. I mean, basic taxes for 99% of people should be really easy. And yet somehow it stayed complicated. And so could an LLM like just do it? Yeah, sure. Like I can totally believe so Intuit going to go bankrupt, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, when you're talking about just how we're going to see a ton of things happen in the next 6 to 12 months, um, the project Auto GPT, have you heard of that? It's this project on GitHub. It has like 22,000 stars in a few weeks. Um, there's another project called Baby AGI, and there's a similar thing where you just basically loop GPT-4 and with also long-term memory. So you get some vector database and you just kind of loop it with some instructions. And Baby HI, you create this task list first, and then you go through all the tasks, and then they're not that robust, or they're kind of buggy. Not only buggy, it just doesn't work completely that well. But it's the hottest project on GitHub, and it's in 6 months, people are gonna figure out some crazy stuff, just because
It's such
the
early days.
yeah, the concept is there, and it's so fascinating to see this, and then you just run it, you loop it, and you don't know what's gonna happen because it's just looping, itself, and it's like caution, caution, we don't know what's gonna happen if you don't watch it.
Yeah.
It's yeah, funny.
Yeah, well, it's Karpathy has been tweeting out all of these interesting things about how to think about LLMs as like a CPU, like the new CPU. These like trying to reframe the way that we think about this stuff to sort of open our minds up to the possibilities. Yeah, it's like bolting other things onto LLMs is going to be. It could be that 6 months from now, some other thing comes out of the woods and like we forget about LLMs because we're so like, that's a real possibility. It's so hard to believe. But, I was having a conversation with my sister yesterday and I was talking about how shocked I was when AlphaGo happened. I mean, I was just really stunned. Like literally for a couple of days, I couldn't believe when AlphaGo was happened, and then it just kept doubling down, and then AlphaFold happened, and the protein folding problem, like that was something I thought a lot about like 20 years ago, and so like I had a sense of like how momentous a problem this was and how difficult a problem, how unbelievably difficult it was, and it's just like done, right? And like it happened so fast. And we're not, it's not, a year, 2, 3 years later, we're not stunned by it. The world outside isn't, because we keep getting these bigger and bigger and bigger shocks as the tech moves forward. So like, okay, what's the thing that's going to happen in 6 months that makes us totally forget about GPT-4? Right? Like, now think about that. Like, what would it take? It's like, oh man, just to put it in context, right?
I think one of the thing that shocks me about GPT 3.5 and 4 is like how much it can understand things. There's some people like on Twitter who have this narrative. They're pushing that, oh, these LLMs, GPT-4 or whatever, even it can't understand anything. It just spits out,
Stochastic parrot.
yeah, the
Yeah.
next token or something. It doesn't know what it's talking about. But in my experience, it's what's shocking about it is there's certain things that it has to understand, to spit out an answer, and the level of its understanding, it's far from perfect, um, but the level of its understanding, it blows me away sometimes. Sometimes I'm like, I'm so
It seems
shocked.
like a simple problem initially. It's just like, tell me, guess what the next token is. But imagine that I'm asking that, I give it the first 4 words of an essay that it has to finish. And the essay is going to be, 3 paragraphs long, right? So it's like, well, you know, and you're about to start the next sentence, the first sentence of a first paragraph. So you're facing questions like, what are the concepts I need to communicate? What's the best order to do those in? Of when I communicate a concept, what's the right way to word it? And then think about all the different ways that a sentence can be constructed to I mean, because you can say the same thing like 100 different ways, right? A little longer, a little shorter. It's got all these nuances and that kind of stuff for it. You got to figure out all that kind of stuff, right? And then you got to break it down to the grammar that you want to use. And you've got to answer all that stuff to say, what's the first word of the first sentence of the next paragraph? Like you have to have already planned ahead, right? So to say what the likely first word of the next paragraph is, we're basically telling the model, you have to figure out all this other stuff, the planning, the concepts, all the different ways they could be expressed, how to structure it, right? To be able to predict what the first word is, right? Like all that has to happen. Like that's happening in our heads. And and in fact, it's a reason why a lot of people think that language is, in human beings plays a really important role in our intelligence, the intelligence that we bring to bear in the world, because it adds so many tools and it requires so much it requires you to develop so much sophistication just to be able to use language. Well, now we've done this with computers, right? And on the one hand, people are like, oh, it's just giving you a probability table for the next word, right? And on the other hand, well, for those probabilities to be right, it has to know a lot about the world. And it's that a lot about the world that we're now learning to tap into. Like we've figured out how to get the models to do that, which is itself is a stunning accomplishment. And at GPT-3, they had that. And with Chat GPT-3, what we saw was now we got to get it out. We got to get it to give it back to us when we ask for it. And that was really hard. But they figured out how to do that with Chat GPT-3. And then with GPT-4, they just doubled down. They went really big. I mean, that's a way of thinking about what's going on. But all of those dimensions are just going to keep getting better.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like the whole narrative where, oh, these LLMs, they're just parrots, they're just regurgitating whatever they've copied on from the internet, right? It misses the point of, like, I think it's this misunderstanding of how these LLMs are trained. Like they think the training with transformers is the way it's actually, that's the whole picture. That's all it's doing, and it's just repeating it out, right? And it misses, I think, this kind of this emergent behavior that is probably, in my opinion, the most notable thing about these LLMs in the past, let's say, 6 to 12 months, is the emergent behavior of the under of the understanding of the world and understanding of what you're saying and what you're trying to accomplish, and all of that. That it's gathered, it's emerged from all of its data, and its training. That to me is the most fascinating part of it, and it's giving this different life to these AI models. Whereas before, you just had, sure, translate, Google Translate, and different things spitting out things, but it didn't have that understanding. Um, and so, yeah, GPT-3 or 3.5 was huge, right? Combining Instruct GPT and all this chat interface. But now you have GPT-4, which bumps up the understanding even more. And now it's like, is OpenAI standing still? Are they just like, saying, "Oh, let's rest on GPT-4"? No, they're pushing forward their next,
Well, we don't know what they're
iterations.
doing.
Yeah, we don't know, but obviously they're
Yeah, they're still spending money.
something. Yeah, yeah,
They're still
exactly.
hiring people.
Yeah, so it's just this understanding that AI has will just grow immensely. We don't know exactly how fast or what, but that to me is the most shocking thing right now, of how fast the understanding has grown, and all of the capabilities are following that
I think
understanding.
that's what's shocking about it, right? It's like the technology itself, the improvement curve is actually really quite smooth. Like there aren't a lot of like I mean, inside the field, there's these constant stream of micro surprises, and every once in a while you get a big surprise. Like ChatGPT-3, I think it was a big surprise for a lot of people, because it was a discontinuous step against the state of the art for being able to make good use of an LLM. But inside the field, you shouldn't be. But but externally, what happens is the technology eventually it crosses these thresholds where suddenly it goes from like not useful for something to useful for something. That feels like a big step, right? And yeah, it's uh, crazy
I
time.
think what happened was the the understanding of these LLMs just like it crossed a point and it's growing so fast where it became useful in so many things and it's becoming more useful. And that's kind of like the wake up kind of moment for people. Um, yeah. Um, it's also interesting to me that and correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like AI, the people making these models, etc., they understand like what goes into making a model and pulling the data and creating all the parameters, all that stuff, but they don't really understand how how the AI, the LLM, is like creating that understanding of the world and how it's creating, let's say, whatever it's generating, like the it's a little bit unknown. It's a mystery box in a sense, and they call it emergent because they don't understand it. It's like it's it- it's a it's kind of like this I don't want to say it's a secret power, but these AI models are in a way um their own box of just stuff that's happening we don't fully
That kind
understand.
of gets overplayed a little bit. The idea that the people building them don't understand anything about them. It's like it's certainly the case that we don't understand them perfectly. Uh, we understand a lot about what's going on inside the models. Unlike the human brain, you can deeply inspect. And inspecting it's not like, in a piece of computer code, everything is a switch, like control flows through it and everything is kind of atomic and whatnot. Like, what's happening inside a large language model and all the weights, you have to take a whole lot of weights into account to sort of understand some particular things. So the way that you go about breaking down what it's doing is different. And attacking it in a completely reductionist way, finding the one neuron that does the trick, like that's rarely going to be the way you understand some aspect of its behavior. But there are a lot of things that can be understood because they are they're transparent to us in the sense that you can deeply inspect everything going on inside the model, as it were. Like as a user, you don't see what's going on, but the people developing the models, they can look inside these models, and people they're dissecting these things. You know, they do keep surprising their creators. You get it. That's what the emergent thing is. The emergent thing is, wow, that came out of nowhere. Like emergent behavior is where you have the model's terrible, the model's terrible, the model's terrible, the model's terrible, and then you get this change, typically scaling. That's mainly what we talk about. You get to a certain size, and boom, all of a sudden it can do it, and that's what zero shot was with GPT-3. The zero shot learning was like not there, not there, not there, not there, not there. Boom, pretty good. Like it just like it went from like indistinguishable from random to pretty good. And like once you cross a certain threshold, so and there are 137 documented emergent properties. I think I saw a list the other day of that we've seen in language models so far, like some capability that it just didn't have, and you got to a certain scale, and all of a sudden it could do it. So that emergence is we didn't see it coming as we were scaling the model up, so we're surprised. But people will say, why did this start working? Right? Like if we didn't know anything about models, we'd have no clue. It's just, let's just keep making it bigger, feed it more data. And that's really not the world that we're in. In fact, a lot of the refinements that go into these models they're not just people trying stuff at random or even having a theory about why stuff is going on, having kind of a directed search. There's a certain amount of that which is going on for definitely. But there's also a component of researchers, they get a model, it does a particular thing, and then they take it apart. Why does it do this? They form a theory, they do some experiments or whatnot, and they kind of narrow it down. Like they got a decent idea about why it's doing something, and then they make further advances based on that. And depending on whether they're productive or unproductive, you get more support for your theory about this is what's going on inside the model. That's kind of the level of understanding that we're getting. It's not zero, it's not total,
Yeah.
but like the narrative that it's a total black box and we have no idea what's going on, that's just false.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's total black box, but it's more of there is there is some things I bet, but a lot of things we don't
It's
know.
surprising. Yeah.
Of what's happening, how it's forming. It's
We we don't have good theories of sort of information complexity and emergence in information itself. Um, and in fact, it's very likely that our tool for learning to understand that aspect of the world is going to be these models, because you can build models that do and don't. Now you can examine this phenomenon of like really complicated information pools and all the nuance and subtlety that's in there. We've got a machine now that can extract that and embed it, encapsulate it, capture it in its fabric, and then give it back to us under the right stimulus. And that gives us a tool for trying to understand those aspects of the world, which we've never understood before. And I think a thing that you could say about what's going on is the reason we've never understood intelligence is because intelligence is like an embodiment of the complexity of the world, like you capturing and using the complexity of the world to build models and to be able to make predictions. And we just haven't had, and we still don't have a good understanding of all the layers of complexity that exist in the world out there. I mean, backpropagation is a really simple, the fundamental mechanism of neural networks is really, really simple. They only get their complicated behavior because there's complexity embedded in the data we give them. They extract that complexity, right? They crystallize it, and then they can use it to pursue the objective that we're getting them, or to reduce the loss function, which is what happens during training. So that, we're learning a lot about the world through these things. We're going to learn a lot about how the human brain works by looking at how neural networks work, because there's enough parallels. It's a lot of things about the way brains work have been really hard to, because the reductionist thing where, let's put 5 neurons in a petri dish and try to understand the whole brain, it's really got its limits if you can only look at a couple of things. The complexity comes from the interaction of, literally billions of these things. And it's just a fantastically large space of interactions that expresses properties. It's inconceivable how much stuff can be embedded in there, and we've never really had a window into it before, and we do now.
Yeah. So you talked about a bit about Google's PaW model, and navigating robots, planning. What do you think? So when we look out 5 or 10 years in the future with these LLMs becoming multimodal, um, becoming increasingly powerful, do you think? So I had this thought earlier today, which was, if you're competing against Tesla FSD, I think in the short term, in the next 5 years, Tesla's got all the infrastructure, all the data. Huge part of it is latency. They've got the hardware in the cars. It's just hard to catch, I think, Tesla in the next 5 years. But if you look out more longer term, and if you're trying to build an FSD competitor longer term, let's say in 5 to 10 year period, could you take kind of an LLM and build something on top of that? Let's say future LLM, let's say GPT-7 or 8 or something, and build something on top of that that does full self-driving, but uses the capabilities of LLM and the understanding that it has of the world. And could that
That's probably how the 2040 high school students will be doing their science fair projects, to show like how they can get their iPhone to drive their car, right?
exactly could that could that type of company, if they do it well, could it be a competitor to Tesla? Um, how do you kind of think about that?
The world, I like the world's going to change so much so fast when these techs start rolling out. And I think, one of the big limiters is just going to be how fast you can change physical reality, like building the factories, building the cars, and getting them out there. That's going to be a constraint on how fast the tech can grow as it matures. So, if you this a thing to keep in mind, like there are a lot of cars on the road. There's like 1 billion cars out there, something like that, right? And like table stakes for changing the world with full self-driving is 1 million cars. Like that's where it starts, and we're so far from getting to there. What does the world look like at 1 million cars? Like when this industry really starts, like when we get to 1 million cars and we really start the industry, well, who's going to have 1 million cars? Well, a couple of companies in China and Tesla, that will have the capability to actually field 1 million cars, that have the infrastructure. Like who else is working on that right now? Building building a platform that can be, cost effectively scaled to massive scale, like quickly. At that point, like, you know, how many people will, how many code bases will be able to do it? Probably not that many. There will probably be a couple products, maybe only one. I mean, Tesla might be the only one, or it might be that the most likely thing is the market's bifurcated into constrained things that run on expensive hardware and can attack a certain subset of the market. I mean, if Tesla fulfills their ambition of building a completely general purpose one, there's a very good chance they'll be the first player to get to that spot right now, largely because they've got the manufacturing capacity to get there. I mean, they've got a big head start on the technology also. But even if somebody else got up to there, you got to be able to build the fleet. Um, that's a big constraint on what the world looks like at that point. You go way down the world when there's 50 million, 100 million robotaxis. Like the end game is it's a commodity, right? The cars are cheap, they cost 18, 20 cents a mile to operate them. They're just everywhere. You can get one in 2 minutes from almost any, industrialized place in the world. They're displacing maybe 50% of all the miles that get driven. What is Tesla's, at that point, it's still a good business. The margins won't be nearly as high. There'll probably be a number of significant players. It might be regional, where you got a big player in the US, you got another big player in Europe. Maybe you'll have global players that sort of dominate. I think that's kind of what the end game looks like, right? And I don't think that, realistically you get a scenario where like all the robotaxis in the world are Teslas. If Tesla ends up with a fleet of 20% of the robotaxis, they're doing pretty good. If you get to a point where you've got 20% of the robotaxis, you can probably hang on to that lead pretty easily because the barriers to entry are no longer just about the technology. There's 100 other barriers that are going to prevent an incumbent from like ramping up and taking over because the technology at that point is commoditized.
Makes sense. I mean, so you talk about this end game. Um, do you think, okay, a few questions here. So Tesla's approach so far has been we don't need hypothetically these LLMs with emergent understanding, all this stuff. We could tackle it on this vision approach with kind of a more specialized um, approach to vision and the physical world and navigating and planning that physical world. And it's gotten Tesla to a certain point, which is very, very impressive, by far in the lead. And it always seems like Tesla's getting closer and closer to that magical point, where you could fall asleep in
Xena's
the
self-driving car.
yeah, right. But it just seems elusive, right? And you know, there's some who still think we're still just so close, but then other times, like the car does certain things where it's just like at times I'm just like, it's just when is that gonna get to that
Well, it's
place,
because
right?
you're looking at it the way a human looks at the driving problem. The car sees it differently.
Yeah, exactly. But the whole bet with Tesla's approach is like, yeah, it'll be good enough, it'll be equal and better than a human with the approach it's taken, which I could see it working, but on another angle, if hypothetically, um, I guess the other angle would be, can LLMs be used somehow to kind of,
Well, Tesla is using LLMs in the cars now, right? They're using GPTs to solve various aspects of the higher level function. Okay, so when they started, LLMs weren't a thing. In fact, it wasn't until transformers really took off, which was just a couple of years ago, that it became clear that you could use them for vision, that you could use them for these multimodal problems. I would argue that transformers today, the LLM architecture today, is not the right way to go, to build the whole stack. That the right way to use an LLM today, given what we understand about LLMs, is you still use essentially more conventional, say, convolutional network based, front end on your camera processing, and you get it up to a set of abstractions about the environment, and then you bring your transformers in at that point. And that's basically what Tesla's doing. I mean, they had originally been going, convolutional all the way to the top, and then having heuristics on top of that, and basically getting labels out of, they've been getting labels for the environment out, and they, put heuristic code on top of that. it sounds from, stuff Elon said recently, they're starting to use neural networks in control, and they're expecting to push neural networks all the way through the thing. But they've also talked, I mean, at AI Day 2, they talked about this language of lanes thing, that's a GPT, it's a language model that they're using to essentially essentially take this lane connectivity problem, turn it into a sequence problem, and use a transformer to process that, which I think is a great idea. Like, it's a really clever idea for trying to use this stuff. There are lots of other, sub elements of the overall driving problem that you could break out this way too. In the near term, when we're performance constrained and we're kind of technology constrained, because the field's only at a certain level of maturity. Like 100 years from now, there might be a really obvious fix to these things because we have this mature theory of how all this stuff works, but we don't have that right now. So, but based on our empirical understanding of how this stuff works and the experience and that kind of stuff, I still think the way Tesla's doing it, like today, right now, if you were going to pick an architectural approach, just today, even knowing what we know about LLMs and everything else, you'd still be doing what Tesla's doing. Like, it's very likely, given the constraint of the amount of compute that you can put in the car, the latencies you need to have, and all that kind of stuff, the fact that you don't want to need a link to the internet and all that kind of stuff in order to operate, you really want the vehicle to be independent, it's still the right way to go. Could that change? It could totally change. We might learn something about the problem that basically make it so that, there's a whole lot of stuff that we were sort of painstakingly decomposing about the environment into little elements that you could abstract away with, significantly less processing. Like, I'd be surprised if someday we don't find that there are shortcuts to getting to the thing. But for now, the best bet is to do it the way Tesla's doing. Now, if you were come AI, right, like, you're going to go for the super ultra lightweight hardware thing, you might go a different way. And if you were a conventional robotaxi company, it's like, no, we'll spend 10 times as much on the car and we're willing to constrain the environment. You might pick something different. In that situation, you might say, well, maybe we go more for LLMs, in that situation. But given this, the hardware constraints that Tesla's got, the fact that the market they're going after a mass market product, the hardware they put in the car to support FSD, it's a couple $1,000s. It's not $100,000. That lets them get access to a mass market. Like, if that's a constraint for the way that you want to approach a problem, I still strongly believe that the approach that they're taking right now is the right way to do it for that particular market.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it makes sense. There's so many constraints also with latency and compute, hardware, all this stuff. Okay, so long term with after, let's say, robotaxis is proliferated, it's easy to make a model, etc. Tesla moves more into humanoid robots. It's much more maybe um, more general, I guess, in application. Um, does Tesla need at that point? Do they just take their vision model and expand it, or do they add on a LLM to be the brains of the robot, combine something together? Do you think another idea is, does Elon's new AI project, supposedly at Twitter, I think it's called Based AI, does that get put it combined together with what Tesla's doing in terms of vision AI? Like, how does this work out, you think, in 10 years or so?
Oh, 10 years is infinitely far away. 10 years on the other side of the event horizon right now. Yeah, no, it's like, I can only predict, like, the direction. I only have a sense of the direction of the path, forward from where we're at right now. Like, I used to think that, like, there were things about the world 25 years from now that I knew. And then, like, at some point it got to be like, well, maybe 10. And like a couple years ago, it was like maybe 5, and now I'm like, oh, 5 is like way too far. Um, Optimus, a lot of the vision stack, a lot of the, I think a lot of that you can take straight over to Optimus. I think when you get to the higher level stuff, that's, the LLM part, the GPTs that are basically taking the more abstract stuff and making decisions about it. Those are probably different for Optimus because his form factor is different. His constraints are different. He's not worried about speed. He's got a much more complex environment that he's got to move. He's got a much more complex set of choices about how he can go about doing any particular task relative to the car. So I think that once you get beyond we've got decent perception, like everything above that for the robot is just quite a bit different. Today, that's it's a minor component of all the stuff going on in the car. It's a really important component. Like it might matter more to the overall experience, assuming that you've got a certain minimum level of functionality in the perception stack. It might matter more than making the perceptions even better. So it's really important to get that and to continue improving on that kind of stuff. And it's probably the greatest point of innovation in the FSD stack right now is adding more GPTs, refining them, figuring out how to use them well, figuring out if you can consolidate them. Now that they've got single stack and they've got most of the legacy stuff out of there, and then on top of that, they can continue improving the tools that let them squeeze more and more capability out of what they put in the car. Having your own compilers, having your own there's all kinds of analysis and quantization work and compression work and distillation work that you can do to just make more and more fit in the car. As those tools get better, they apply to everything.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's like Elon tweeted something about diffusion seems to be more compute efficient than transformers for vision. It's interesting also at the investor day afterwards, a shock was taking just people around him and other execs. But I asked him about LLMs, and he was saying something basically about they're finding more success or it's more diffusion is more interesting actually than transformers to them. Why do you think that might be the case?
So, I mean, the formulation of using diffusion that I'm most familiar with is like stable diffusion, right? It's like um, diffusion uh, is it's essentially using the patterns in the world to see patterns in noise. You start with noise, and then you stepwise, get to a pattern from that. I need to, that tweet from Elon made me think that I need to go back and look at how people are using diffusion outside of vision models. A simple way to use diffusion in vision models is like, with the nerfs is similar to the nerfs thing is like, if you use it at the tail end. So right now it's hard to close the loop on training a vision model because you got pictures in and labels out. And so if you want to train it, you got to have to have picture label pairs, right? And that's what human labelers do, right? If you can get picture in, picture out, so like you convert it to the internal abstracted representation you need to drive the vehicle, and then you have a backend that converts that back into picture. Now you can close the loop just with lots of pictures. I mean, you literally just go collect tons of data, and you have the model learn to predict the world in terms of a set of abstractions that are useful for driving. And so you train those abstractions up, and you get them, and they get really, really good. This is kind of like how the language model thing works. It's self-supervised. You got tons of text. That's all you need. Nobody has to label the text. You just give it enough text, and it learns the information structure embedded in a large corpus of text, which includes a certain perspective, everything in the world, right? So you'd really like to be able to do that with vision for robots that operate in the real world so that they develop an understanding of physics, objects, the way that light works, the whole range of possible phenomena that can occur in the world, what's likely and not, given the constraints of the world and so on. So diffusion can be a way to do the second half of that, like at a minimum, we can do that. Ashok talked at AI Day 2 about how to use nerfs to do that, which is also a way to go to get to a picture from, but it may be that diffusion is much more computationally efficient way to get the picture out. And so my first cut is might be what he's talking about. Although the way that they worded, the way Ashok just worded that and the way that Elon worded it kind of implies that there's some other stuff going on there too, because there are other, diffusion's a general principle. It doesn't necessarily apply just to pictures. You can use diffusion in language models, for instance, with text and that kind of stuff. It hasn't been as successful there, but maybe it would be successful if people spent more time on it. And it might be that there are other sort of representations of, internal representations to work from where diffusion is good. Like, for instance, the occupancy map. It might be that generating an occupancy map using diffusion is actually a really effective way to get an occupancy map built.
Mhm. Got it. All right. So going back to FSD version 11, so where are we in the bigger picture with FSD? Like, what does version 11 kind of provide? What are the big kind of step forwards, and what's also remaining, before what are the big kind of things it needs to work on
Yeah,
still?
we probably don't have enough time now to like really get into it.
Yeah, we have actually we have about 15-20 minutes.
Um, I've been super happy with it because I've seen a number of kind of core capabilities manifest that weren't present before that have led to significantly improved behavior. And the way that I sort of broadly characterize this in my head is that the is it previously, like when you're on the highway, this is most apparent on the highway because if you've been driving AP for a while, you you know that AP has this kind of sort of robotic aspect of the way that it does stuff. Like once it decides to do a lane change, that turn signal is going to stay on until it completes the lane change. Like it doesn't retract that. Like it's sort of in this mode where you know it's got vehicles in lanes, and it evaluates the situation and base it and then use heuristics to make a decision about what it should do, and then it decides it's going to do that. And so now you're in a flow chart, and the flow chart, the state machine has decided we're going to move from this state to this state, and it waits for that transition to complete. And that's why you're stuck there in the lane with your turn signal going on and no place to move over because the guy didn't let you in when your car turned on the turn signal, right? And you just wait for it to go. When you do lane changes, it's like evaluate the situation, wait 5 seconds, check it again, make sure everything's okay because you're not confident of the perception model. So you check and check and check and check. And then now, we move over to the second lane. Now we reevaluate. Or is there a car in front of us, behind us? Is the situation the same as before we did it? And you accelerate, decelerate. So you get this super clunky thing like come up to the truck, you have to stop, check around, decide you're going to make a lane change, turn on the turn signal, check again, move over, check again. Can I move forward? Then you start to accelerate. It's very clunky, sort of stepwise stuff. And this is in kind of it's a side effect of the fact that you're not super confident about the perception. So you want to stack up a lot of evaluations to be really confident about things before you make decisions. And when you make decisions, because the decisions are getting made in this flow chart, this tree, you don't want the flow chart to get too complicated. So you don't want to have like intermediate states on all of your states. You want to have a state, have another state. So you get that kind of thing. But there are other ways of reframing the problem overall. Like the way a human might think about the thing is, I'm going to do my lane change and I'm going to abort my lane change or change my plan if my path through the world, if things in the world change to make me think something's going to intersect my path, then I reevaluate. And FSD 11, especially on the highway, it feels like it's doing that now. So when you look at the path planner, right? The path planner, it used to be just like, change lanes. And that was it. It would have a single maneuver and it would have some horizon that you could see. And inside that horizon, it would plan a single maneuver. If it completed that maneuver, then it would think about the next thing, where a maneuver was move laterally, move, accelerate, decelerate, whatever. Now you see it planning a path through the world that includes multiple maneuvers. So it can do double lane changes or triple lane changes. It can do interactions with multiple cars on a highway where there's a car gaining on you and you're gaining on another car, and then you change lanes and he changes lanes and the guy's still coming up on you and the car decides to abort. It'll turn on its turn signal for a second to do something, decide it can't do the maneuver, turn the turn signal off. It like immediately reevaluates. So it's continuously plotting these paths through the world. And the thing we don't see is it's plotting those for all the other actors too. So we see our little blue intenticle coming out of the car, but internally it's generating those little intentacles for all the other cars too. And it's looking for where they cross, right? And if they don't cross, the plan is still okay. And I can still keep doing that. And the moment it gets an evaluation where it gets across, it reevaluates now. And it can immediately make a decision to change. And it's a different way of reframing the whole driving problem. Now, I think it's probably not the case that they actually did throw away their entire previous approach. It's probably the case, more likely the case, that they've had this in there and they've been gradually moving from one way of structuring it to another. And the single stack going to single stack, especially on the highway, was an opportunity to take all of these boxes and guardrails and fine-tuned rules that we had sitting on top of the previous perceptions, toss those out, build a new set based on this new sort of paradigm of paths through the world and whether they intersect or not. So the first thing that happens is you throw all the rules out, right? And you build this system, you get it out on a few employee cars, and then you start adding rules because now you need a new set of rules because because perception still isn't perfect, right? It's still got holes in it. It might be better. might be better and might be really significantly better, but there are going to be situations where it doesn't work. So you got to put the guardrails on. You have to like get it out in the real world, see the situations where it's coming up short, and then you have to either decide we're going to fix that perception problem, or we're going to put a guardrail on, or we're going to change the behavior so that the likelihood of it occurring comes way down. So now we're getting 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, 3.4, 3.5 has because you've got some pretty ugly failure modes. You threw out all the guardrails, and people, we've had guardrails on AP for so long and FSD for so long. We've forgotten how ugly it can be when you take all the guardrails off. Like it was pretty ugly when, each time we get a big step change, you get a lot of ugly behavior because you don't want to have guardrails on there that you don't need. But once you change the perception and the planning stack and that kind of stuff, the only way you know if you need the guardrails, take it off and run the cars for a while, right? And then so you find the new ones that you get. And I feel like we're in that kind of state right now. But at the end of this, you know, my guess is we're going to get a few more point revs, and they're going to fill the really ugly failures that where running stop signs or running signals are getting way too close to cars or making short-term decisions that turn out to be bad. Um, and and so we'll have all the smoothness that we're getting, but without the ugly failures. And there probably are behaviors where you start with the guardrail and then you gradually tune it back. Like if there are certain failure modes you're too worried about to give it to people right away, there will be some kinds of behaviors where, they know it's got this capability, but they have it turned off or they have it turned down to 0.1, right? To just see how it's doing. And then as it's in the real world and they're more confident that it can do this thing that they want it to do and it's going to be okay, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. So gradually we see the fruition of these what the new perception capabilities bring to, and of course now these are, plot the paths through the world is in order to make that trick work, you have to be able to search down the possibility tree for all of the actors in the space, and that's combinatorically horrible. Like it really takes a lot of compute. So they've started using neural networks so that instead of searching the whole tree, they just search the most likely branches. They have a neural network look at the situation and say, well, the pedestrian could step out, they could step backwards, they could stop moving, they could run, they could, instead of looking at 100 things, you have a neural network looks at the pedestrian and says, of the top 3 likely things that we need to be concerned with, these are the 3 to examine. So you get a couple of possibilities for each agent. You trace those forward in time. You get a probabilistic distribution of future paths, and then you look to see if any of them are a problem and you need to change your plan. So it's a pretty significant fundamental change. And that's I'm happy that they got it. Does this by itself get us like through all of the problems that we know about right now? It might, we're going to have to see. Tesla themselves, they probably don't know. This is one of those things you put it out in the world and you try it, and the world throws ugly things at you. I think we're going to get, we're going to get some more 9s out of this for sure. Will there be a V12? Yeah, I think probably. Just, kind of looking at the schedule, but man, I'm super, like, it feels like a really significant improvement to me. There are ugly things right now. Like this is probably the most dangerous time for V11 because,
Yeah. My experience is because I've had it since like for a while from I think 11.3.3 or something from um and I immediately I'm like, whoa, this is like a big jump in terms of like smoothness, also capability. I think what you're talking about is exactly what gives you more confidence is it's planning, more complex things, taking in consideration more things around. And I'm like, I don't want to go back because I have my Model 3 has the newest version. It's had it for like almost a month, and the Model Y we have is more on a regular schedule. So I'm like, I don't want to go back to pre, 11 point whatever 3. It was that much of a big upgrade, but then there are these occasional things it does where I'm like, whoa, because I'm going on a road and it tries to take a left turn when there's no reason to take a left. It's just like navigation, everything's going right, and it just I have to be extra careful. And I guess it makes sense. I liked your explanation because it's like, yeah, if the guardrails are taking it off and they're having to put more new rules into the system, then I think you do have to, be uh, vigilant in terms of how you're driving. You always have to be vigilant, but I think version 11.3, whatever, 6 now, it's like it could trick you into thinking it's so much better but it has its blind spots that it needs to work on. But yeah, it's a great
Well, so, we've just gone to that transition where it got good enough that they're like, now let's give it to 400,000 people, right?
yeah,
So you've
yeah,
got this step up in risk because, on that one step, maybe it got a little bit better, but they're getting 1,000 times as much feedback now. So that feedback loop is 1,000 times richer and denser and faster than it was before. So they've got to the point where they can use the fleet and they feel like it's safe enough that they can give it to people, but iterate, 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 iterate. So we're getting an update a week right now. And it's probably the case that as long as we keep getting an update a week, they've got stuff that they know that they can make better and that they need to make better, right? Because they want to keep pushing those things out.
I mean, I like the new voice feedback from like it just I would imagine that's very helpful. Just because I mean before you're taking interventions and that's helpful, but it just maybe prioritizes, these voice
I think it's
ones.
just a way of filtering interventions,
Yeah,
right? So they
exactly.
transcribe those into text or whatnot.
Yeah.
And when they, imagine that, you know, they've got this endless list of interventions to kind of look at, but they look at clusters of interventions, right? They have different ways of sorting the thing. And they look at, like, they could be clustered in the situation. They could be clustered just in a location. Like, we're getting tons of like, this is the simplest way to think of it. We get interventions every single time a Tesla goes down this road, right at this point, right? Like, you could start out by just looking for those, right? So you find all the ones that you get that kind of stuff. Then what you do is you take the textual reports that came with the ones that got textual report, you do a k-means clustering of them, and you look at which cluster is the biggest, right? And then, okay, what's common among all of these ones that was the same? You get these noted things. People, I think, I'm sure that some of these things get individually reviewed by, but the game that they're playing right now is mostly statistical. So they've got a big database of interventions. They want a big database of information. The more interventions you get, the richer stuff you have to work with, and the more you can find the real value in it. Focus your engineering resources on resolving those, right? Just go down the list of the ones that are both frequent and serious, for some combination of frequent and serious, and then you gradually work your way down to the less frequent, less serious ones.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would imagine that the voice, you know, explanation interventions have a higher priority in the sense that, let's say you have 10,000 reported or something, or a day. You can't get through all of them, but you can, as you're saying, like match a group. Perhaps there's a large grouping of similar interventions happening, right? And they can figure that out, and then you're going through that. But because it's a signal when a person is explaining it, like it's it's
Yeah,
important.
I mean, one of the things that you get out of the signal explaining it thing is like if you're getting if the interventions are distributed, like they have a common theme to them, but it's not an easy one to like mine the data for. Like people interventions at intersections are gonna be super common, and there's a zillion different reasons for them, right? But like maybe you have classes of intersections that are kind of popping up in your, you do a histogram in some dimension of the interventions that you're getting, and now you look at the high frequency ones. Now you can filter on keywords or something that, for what the reports were. And you can see, if you see ran red light, like, okay, it might be happening at lots of different intersections. But you can look at all of those. You can see what the common elements are. You can take the recordings. You can look at what was going on inside the thing. And you can pretty rapidly drill down on, okay, do we need a guardrail? Do we need some more training? Do we need a different rule? Is this a bug in an existing guardrail? Like the bugs in the existing guardrails, there are probably going to be a lot of those, and finding those, like, you get a whole lot of improvement for almost for free when you find a bug, because you fix the bug, right? And it's just all upside. That you had an intention for how you built the program. It's not performing that way because you made a mistake in your implementation. You fix that, it's win-win, right?
Exactly. We're out of our 2 hour time. Our time in this podcast studio is over. But I did have a lot of questions on your thoughts on AGI. Like, how close are we? What's your
Doomerism.
or not just doers, but yeah, first on just how close we are to so-called whatever you define HI as, but and also on kind of you know the 6 month moratorium idea that Elon was promoting, but AI safety in general, also the future implications of AI, meaning how it's going to impact different, parts of society. But that's, not going to be possible right now. But it seems like we're in a very like a hyper, impactful, changing like world of AI right now. And
Drama, yeah,
yeah,
drama.
it's very
People inside the space are
yeah.
like they're being dramaed to death, and they're complaining loudly about it.
Um, but the thing that I think maybe illustrates it interesting illustration is Karpathy had a blog post like almost 10 years ago where he had a picture of Obama pressing his foot against the scale where the person on the scale didn't know that he was pressing and all the people around him were laughing. And Karpathy's blog was basically, can AI when will AI be
I
able to
think,
solve
yeah,
this?
he was
And
demoralized at how far away this seemed
exactly,
to be, right?
exactly. And that type of that picture is in a sense a type of milestone of AI being able to
Explain the
understand.
joke.
Yeah, this a very complex situation, including humor and a lot of nuance. Can like when will AI be able to do that? And what's interesting, I think, with GPT-4 and becoming multimodal and explaining, and the thing is, they haven't really publicly shown much of it, but my guess is it can explain pretty, you know,
It's
complex pictures.
I think it does the explanation because he commented on it. I tried to get him like I replied to the comment and tried to get a response to him, but he didn't respond to me. But I think the follow up seems to be it explains it, but we don't know if it can explain it because it's in the training corpus. Like maybe it's
Got
seen
it.
the joke and maybe it saw
Interesting.
some place where somebody explained it, and he said they were looking, but they hadn't found it in there.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because whether or not GPT-4 fully explains that joke or not, right now,
It's doing similar.
it's around that vicinity of being able to do that, which marks a huge milestone in terms of the capabilities of AI to to be at a closer point of human understanding of the world and reasoning. And obvious, I mean, it's I'm not going to say that, GPT-4 has, eclipsed human, but it's AI is just progressing so fast. And I think it's an interesting point of history where we
AGI
are.
could be the next FSD, like in terms of our actual experience of it. FSD, like getting a car to drive itself, is a hard problem, and it's taken a lot longer than people thought it would. And AGI may well turn out to be similar to that, right? Where like we keep getting these giant leaps, but at every giant leap, we're like, there's still something missing. And then you drill down and you're like, oh yeah, there's this thing. Now, if we solve that problem, we'd have it. And then you get that one and you're like, still not quite right.
Well, yeah, I'm thinking actually that process could take quite a while.
Or it
Yeah,
might not. It could be one more and then we're done. That's why you get this big this sort of bifurcation of opinions in the space, right? There are people who fear we're getting close to one and done, and but there are people who've been in the field for a really long time who they've seen the process and they've seen so many breakthroughs and are like, oh come on, I've heard this so many times, right?
yeah, interesting stuff. James, thanks for
This
chatting
was fun.
again. Yeah, I would love to do it again. Yeah, I don't know when I'll be able to. I'm headed on this long summer trip for 4 or 5 months around the world. But yeah, we'll see. I mean, 4 or 5 months is like an eternity.
Yeah, it is.
Gonna happen.
See you on
when
the other
come back.
side. Yeah.
Exactly. Crazy stuff. All right, thanks a lot, and thanks everyone for tuning in.